the truth.
Welcome back to Fox News Sunday. Good to see you.
Good morning, John. It's good to be with you.
So between Thursday night when the president or the White House made the announcement that he'd be meeting with Kim Jong-un and then Friday afternoon, the White House seemed to shift a little bit. Sarah Huckabee Sanders saying that we need to see concrete and verifiable actions before a meeting takes place. The NSC later said she wasn't putting preconditions on a meeting, but should there be preconditions for such a meeting?
Well, John, I think it's important to step back to remember how we got to this place. For an awfully long time, America whistled past the graveyard while the North Korean regime, including this particular leader, continued to develop their nuclear weapons program. This administration came in, the president talked about it in his campaign, and put enormous pressure on the North Korean economy and on the North Korean leadership. That gave us this opportunity where Kim Jong-un now has committed to stopping nuclear testing, stopping missile tests, allowing exercises to go forward, something that's been incredibly contentious in the past, and at the same time saying that denuclearization, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization is a topic for discussion. And that's when Kim Jong-un said, I'd like to meet with the president. The president made the decision that it was the right time to begin that conversation.
So again, should there be any preconditions put on a meeting? What do you think Kim needs to do in order to get that big meeting that he's been looking for with the U.S.
president? I just mentioned him. That's what he needs to do. He can't conduct nuclear testing. He's got to stop the missile testing that he's been hard at for the last years. He's got to continue to allow us to perform our militarily necessary exercises on the peninsula. And then he's got to make sure that he leaves on the table that discussion for denuclearization. These are real achievements. These are conditions that the North Korean regime has never submitted to in exchange for conversations. You know, John, I had a chance this weekend to reread the history, the CIA's history of the negotiations that have taken place over the last decades. I'll admit I took a couple hours to watch Wichita State basketball, but I reread them. Never before have we had the North Koreans in a position where their economy was at such risk and where their leadership was under such pressure that they would begin conversations on the terms that Kim Jong-un has conceded to at this point.
So what are we willing to give him in exchange for concessions?
Nothing. Not, you mean for the discussion
well,
for President Trump to come?
Are we willing to give a guarantee that we're not going to try to overthrow the regime, as Secretary of State Tillerson said last year? Are we willing to ease some sanctions? What are we willing to do?
Yeah, look, these discussions will play out over time. This first meeting, I think, is between the president and the leader of North Korea, the two people who are the decision makers, who will ultimately decide what arrangements are acceptable. But make no mistake about it, while these negotiations are going on, there will be no concessions made. The activity of this administration to disrupt the North Korean economy, to put pressure on North Korea, to galvanize the world in a way that you have countries from the Middle East to Europe and Asia placing sanctions on the North Korean regime, those will continue, and we'll see how the talks and the negotiations proceed.
Intelligence experts remind me that the CIA does personality profiles of global leaders all the time. What can you tell us about Kim Jong-un's CIA personality profile?
Yeah, so we know a fair amount about him. We know that he is rational, in the sense of he responds to stimulus. We've seen this. We've watched this administration apply pressure, and now we've watched him come to the negotiating table. The CIA has an important role as these conversations take place. We need to make sure that we can inform the president of the history of deceit of this regime, where they have committed to things in the agreed framework, and then subsequently we need to make sure that we go into these discussions understanding those risks. The nature of Kim Jong-un himself, he's still a very young leader, but clearly in charge of his country. Those are the kinds of things that we can share publicly about him, and President Trump is now committed to having at least a first conversation.
So I'm curious that the president's tough-minded approach to North Korea, the things he said, the things he tweeted about, were those informed by your personality profile of Kim, or did the president just freelance all that?
Well, the president had in his mind, even during the campaign, that North Korea was an enormous challenge. But I brief the president nearly every day, and we have shared with the president every bit of information we have about the country, about its economy, about its missile systems.
About what he might react,
about how Kim Jong-un might react, and how North Korea might respond, how the globe might respond. And the president has built an enormous coalition aimed at a singular outcome, which is the denuclearization of the peninsula.
So where do they meet?
I don't know.
What needs to be taken into consideration when discussing where they would meet? I mean, you wouldn't want, I assume that they wouldn't either meet in North Korea or the United States, probably not South Korea either. So Geneva, Reykjavik, as Gorbachev and Reagan did?
Seems to me, John, a lot less important about where they meet than the substance of the discussion. And I think that's different, too. President Trump isn't doing this for theater. He's going to solve a problem. And so the location of the meeting will determine the exact timing of the meeting. The president and the team will figure out. But what's most important is what's discussed. And the clarity and the strength and resolve of this president and this administration to achieve the outcome that Americans so desperately deserve.
Let's move on to Russia. President Vladimir Putin did an interview with NBC in the last few days in which he said he could not care less if Russians tried to hack the U.S. election because the people who were doing the hacking were not connected to the Kremlin. No connection to the Kremlin? What does the CIA know about that?
That's false.
So tell me what you know.
The Russians attempted to interfere in the United States elections in 2016. They also did so before that. There's a long history of Russian efforts to influence the United States and conduct influence operations against the United States. And it was Russians who actually engaged in this, not somebody from outside of the country or disconnected from the Russia.
But when you say Russians, Russians with ties to the Kremlin, Russians with ties to Putin's regime?
Yes.
So do we know if their efforts actually affected the outcome of the election?
Yeah, the intelligence community has been clear that's not our role to discuss that, but there's not been a single indication that any vote was changed, that ballots were tampered with, or that there was any outcome determined by the intelligence community. The intelligence community has simply said that's not our role to make that determination.
Is it fair to say you don't really know for sure?
The intelligence community's role is very clear. We talk about the things that happened, what the Russians did, what the other actors, not just Russians, have done historically in the United States to try.
Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 M's in my bank account.